first thing anyone remembered was the veil. Not her face, not her hands, not even the trembling shape of her figure, but the veil, a shroud of grey that hung heavy with soil, clotted with something darker, as if it had already lain beneath the ground for years before it ever touched her brow. They said it was cut from burial linen, and though no one dared ask her, everyone whispered it, for the smell that trailed her was not perfume nor flower, but the faint musk of opened graves. The cypress trees leaned over her path that morning, branches bending low as though they wished to touch her, to mark her, to keep her from escaping, and beneath their watchful green-black shadows, the townsfolk, gathered in silence, pressing their hands to their mouths, afraid that even the breath they released might draw her attention. No music played, no bells rang, no horse or carriage carried her. She simply appeared, step by step, out of the mist that rose from the graveyard's edge, her slippers streaked with wet soil, her veil dragging across the grass that grew thick between tombstones. "She comes from where the dead lie," a woman whispered, clutching her rosary so hard the beads cracked. "Hush, hush, she will hear you," another hissed, though her own thighs never left the bride. The veil hid her mouth, but some swore they saw it moving, as though she whispered names one after another, names that belonged not to the living, but to those whose bones lay beneath the soil she crossed. The path that should have led her to the chapel door twisted strangely that day. The crowd swore it. They saw her walk toward the church. Yet each time she lifted her foot, the stones of the graveyard shifted, pulling her nearer to the iron gates, guiding her deeper among the markers of the dead. The minister, an old man with shaking hands, stood at the chapel steps, his prayer book clutched tight, sweat on his brow, and though his lips moved with words of blessing, his eyes darted, frantic, for she was not approaching him. She was drifting, slow and steady, down into the cemetery. The children wept without knowing why, clinging to their mothers' skirts, while the men whispered of ill omens, of bargains struck long before any of them were born, of the girl's family cursed in bloodlines too tangled to ever be cut free. Still she walked, her veil dragging, her hands pale as though blood no longer touched them, and every step echoed louder than the last, like hollow knocks against a coffin. "Salid, she is not walking to be wed," murmured a voice from the crowd, low and cracked. "She is walking to be claimed." The minister at last descended the steps, desperate, his voice louder now. Trembling with scripture, "In the house of the Lord you must come forth, child, do not wander into shadow." But she did not lift her head, and the veil, heavy with earth, swayed as though caught by a breath no living man could feel, and her path deepened into the graveyard's heart. By the oldest cypress she stopped, and there, with soil still dripping from her veil, she knelt as though before an altar unseen, her fingers clawing gently at the ground, parting grass, pressing against the earth as a lover would a hand. "Do you take him?" the minister cried, voice cracking. "Do you take him as husband in the sight of God?" Her head tilted, slow, unnatural, and though the veil still covered her face, a faint sound issued forth, a whisper so thin it seemed more breath than voice. "Not God." The crowd recoiled, crossing themselves, turning away, yet unable to leave, as though their feet were bound to the earth just as hers was, rooted in soil that had swallowed too much. And then it came, faint at first, but growing, a low stirring beneath the ground, the shifting of dirt, the breaking of roots, something ancient and patient moving beneath. Her fingers, rising to meet the touch of its bride. The veil lifted slightly, stirred not by wind but by breath from below, and in that dim space between cloth and skin, a glimpse of her mouth, smiling where no joy belonged. The cypress groaned as though in mourning. The bells in the chapel rang without hands upon them, and the ground itself seemed to sigh with hunger. No one dared step forward, no one dared speak again, for they all knew the truth of what they were witnessing. She had not come from the church to the graveyard, she had come from the graveyard to the church, and her vows had already been spoken in soil no priest would consecrate. The last thing they saw before the mist consumed her was the veil pressing flat against her face, pulled inward by something beneath, as if the earth itself had leaned up and kissed her, and when the mist lifted, she was gone, leaving only footprints in the dirt, leading not away but deeper, as though she had sunk beneath step by step into the very ground itself. The ring was not gold, not silver, not any metal a bride should wear. It was iron, rusted and brittle, dug from earth blackened by years of rain and rot. And yet when it slid upon her finger, it did not break, it did not bend. It clung as if it had always belonged there, as if it had been waiting for her hand. Her groom was no man of flesh, but a name carved deep in stone, and the stone was older than the town itself, its letters worn smooth, its edges sunken, the inscription nearly erased except for the last name. That still clung to the surface like a scar. Beckett, the cursed name that no one dared speak aloud, the name the townsfolk swore had been sealed away, yet here it was, whispered in the breath of the bride as she knelt beside it. The veil hung heavy, stained with soil, brushing the carved letters as she leaned low, and the air thickened as though the ground itself held its breath, waiting for her to speak the vows no priest would utter. She raised her left hand, pale and trembling, and with her right she slid the iron ring over her finger, slow as though pressing it through flesh instead of air, and when it touched the bone beneath, a sound cracked from the earth, not thunder, not wind, but the snapping of wood far below, as if coffins deep underground had shifted in their sleep. The witnesses who lingered at the cemetery gates swore they heard it, a groaning sound, the earth loosening, sighing, as though making room for something that had begun to rise. "She weds a grave," whispered an old man, his eyes milky and blind. Yet he seemed to see more than those who still had sight. "Hush," hissed another, clutching her shawl tight. "Do not call it what it is, for it may hear you." And then the ground beneath the stone trembled, a faint stirring like water disturbed in a well, and the cypress branches above shook through the wind was still, scattering needles that fell in slow, deliberate patterns across the veil of the bride. She bent lower, pressing her lips to the name carved in stone, and from her mouth came words no living tongue could shape, syllables cracked and broken, uttered like secrets passed from worm to worm in soil, long sealed from light. The iron ring tightened on her finger, cutting the skin, and a bead of blood welled there. Not bright red, but dark, almost black, as if the vein it called forth was not hers alone. The minister who had followed her dared raise his hand. Trembling, his Bible open, though the words upon the page had begun to blur, sliding like liquid ink. "Child, stop. You do not know what you bind yourself to. You do not—" Her head turned, slow, veil shifting with the movement, and though her face remained hidden, the iron ring gleamed in the grey light, darker than shadow, heavier than stone, and the minister's voice broke as though swallowed in his own throat, leaving him gasping, unable to finish the blessing, unable even to speak his own prayer. And then it came, faint but certain, a knock from beneath the stone. One, then another, deliberate, steady, as though a hand had rapped from inside the earth, asking to be let out, or worse, answering the vow that had just been spoken. The crowd shuddered, mothers pulling their children back, men stepping away through their feet dragged, unwilling to turn their backs on what had risen, for they all knew the sound of knocking, yet to hear it from the ground was to hear an invitation none dared accept. The bride lowered her bloodied finger to the soil, pressing it against the stone, letting the ring touch the earth. And when it did, the knock became a scrape. The scrape became a push, and the soil swelled upward as though something pressed from below. "Who among you will stand?" whispered the blind man again. "Who among you will break the bond before it is too late?" But none moved, none spoke. They only watched as the veil brushed against the swelling ground, and the earth seemed to pulse, to breathe, rising and falling beneath her touch. The iron ring glowed faintly, not with fire but with the dull heat of something alive, and those close enough swore they smelled iron in the air, sharp, metallic, mingled with the scent of grave earth and rot. "Do you take him?" the minister tried once more, voice weak. "Do you take him as—" "Yes," she whispered, the veil trembling with the word, a word too soft to carry. Yet somehow all heard it, ringing in their ears, shaking in their bones. And as she spoke, the ground split beneath her, a crack in the soil opening like a mouth exhaling a breath so cold, the mist around her froze into frost. The stone before her shifted, groaned, tilted as though being lifted from below, and through the crack spilled fingers of root and bone entwined, clawing upward, not to escape, but to reach, to touch, to claim the hand that bore the ring. The veil fluttered as though stirred by laughter, muffled, hollow, rising from beneath the earth, and when the frost cleared, the townsfolk swore they saw, her hand clasped tightly with another's, pale, skeletal, wrapped in soil, the iron ring gleaming where their fingers met. They appeared overnight, a trail of shoes leading from the town square to the graveyard, abandoned as if their owners had stepped out of them mid-stride and vanished into the air. There were boots caked in red clay, slippers worn thin at the soles, children's leather lace-ups polished as though for Sunday service, and even the cracked stiff shoes of the elderly, all lined neatly in pairs, stretching along the dirt road like a procession that never ended, guiding the eye toward the gates of the cemetery where the bride had last been seen. No guests were visible, no voices called, no music played, only the silence of leather left behind, and the eerie order of shoes that pointed toward the grave. As if obeying an invitation none dared refuse, the townsfolk gathered at a distance, whispering among themselves, "Where are the feet that wore them?" They walked on without them. They followed her where we cannot. Some claimed the shoes still shifted ever so slightly, as though invisible feet still pressed against them, dragging forward step by step, the procession unfinished, the march eternal at dusk. A boy dared touch. A small scuffed boot no larger than his own hand, and when his fingers brushed the leather he swore it quivered beneath him, warm, as though it had been worn only moments ago, as though the child who had walked in it still lingered, unseen, but not gone. The minister warned the people not to approach, raising his Bible high, voice cracking, "These are not relics of the living, but offerings, left for one who calls them. Do not lay hand upon them, lest you too be summoned." But his words rang hollow, for even he could not deny the strange order of the shoes, each pair perfectly placed, none toppled, none scattered, as though the dead themselves had arranged them. At night the road became restless, and those who lived near swore they heard the faint shuffle of feet, the scuff of soles against dirt, the dragging of steps too many to count, and yet when they peered from their windows, they saw only the shoes, standing silent in the moonlight. "She calls them," whispered an old woman who had seen more funerals than weddings. "She calls the ones who are promised, and they go gladly, for the bride belongs not to the church, but to the grave, and she leads them home, a farmer, drunk and angry, spat into the road and shouted, 'Then let her call me, I will not go, I will not leave my land, nor my boots, nor my soul for her to claim.' Yet when dawn broke, his boots were there among the others, set neatly in the line, the laces tied, the soles damp with dew. But the man was nowhere to be found, not in his house, not in his field, not even in his bed, as though the earth had swallowed him whole while his shoes were left behind. One by one, the townsfolk began to recognize the shoes, pairs that belonged to neighbors, to children, to kin long-buried, shoes that should not have been there, shoes that no cobbler alive had made in decades, cracked and crumbling yet standing tall in the procession. By the seventh night, the line of shoes stretched far beyond the town's edge, looping back on itself like a serpent devouring its tail, circling the graveyard, enclosing it, guarding the place where the bride had pressed her vows into the soil. The children began to dream of shoes, shoes tapping against the floorboards, shoes climbing the stairs, shoes waiting at their bedside. And in the morning their parents found small footprints in ash across the hearth, though no child had risen from bed. It was said that if you listened closely in the black hours just before the rooster crowed, you could hear a voice beneath the shuffle, a woman's voice low and sweet, whispering a hymn that no church would dare teach, a song that guided the shoes forward step by step into the earth where the procession would never end. And on the eighth night, when the moon lay low and pale against the trees, the townsfolk woke to a new terror, for the shoes were no longer empty. From the gates of the graveyard to the steps of the chapel, the shoes were filled, not with flesh, but with shadows, black, outlines of legs and bodies faint as smoke, yet walking, moving, dragging themselves toward the altar that waited in the dark. The veil of the bride flickered among them, trailing at the procession's front, her head bowed, her ring gleaming faintly in the night, and every shoe behind her moved in rhythm, a march of those who had been claimed by dawn. The shadows were gone, but the shoes remained, lined and waiting, a silent army of leather husks, as though poised for the next night when the hymn would rise again. and the townsfolk knew with hearts heavy as stone that one day the line of shoes would reach every doorstep, and none would resist when it came to claim them, for even as they watched, one more pair appeared at the road's edge, shoes still damp with morning dew, the shoes of the minister himself, though he still stood among them, trembling, clutching his Bible, staring down at what had been left behind, and when he raised his eyes again, he swore the veil was waiting at the cemetery gate, her head tilted, her hand outstretched as though beckoning him forward. The vows were spoken not beneath vaulted arches or before candle flame, but in the hollow dark of soil, where ribs had cracked open like doorways, and skulls lay tilted as though listening for her voice. She whispered promises into hollow spaces, where worms had made their home, her breath warm against the dust of bone, and though no living ear should have answered, the earth shivered with response, as if it too remembered the weight of words that bind. The townsfolk who watched from the cemetery gates swore they saw her kneeling, her veil pressed flat against the dirt, her lips moving in silence, but the sound carried strangely, curling through the air like smoke, low and jagged, in syllables no priest had ever taught, in tones that made even the bravest men turn away. Claimed they heard her speak of fidelity, not to life but to decay, not to love, but to the promise of being swallowed whole, of lying forever with the one whose name was etched in stone, bound in silence deeper than any grave. And though her words were fragile, hushed, brittle as wind through the reeds, something beneath the soil answered, not in a living tongue, but in a voice cracked and heavy, like stone grinding against stone, like marrow splintering under weight, a tongue that belonged not to men but to what men become when breath has left them. The minister staggered forward, his hand raised high, trembling, his Bible clutched as if it might anchor him against the tide that pressed outward from her whisper. You speak to no husband, child. You speak to shadows, to dust, to damnation itself. But before he could finish, the veil shifted and the bride's head turned ever so slightly toward him, and though her face remained hidden, the sound that answered from below struck him silent, a sound so deep it rattled the marrow in his bones and left his jaw clenched shut, teeth grinding until blood welled at his gums around her. The earth grew restless, the soil swelling, cracking, and from it rose fragments of bone, pale against the dark, ribs arching upward like the prongs of a crown, finger bones twitching as though remembering the shape of a hand, skulls tilting forward to witness the ceremony they themselves had been called to attend. The bride pressed her palm to one such fragment, and the iron ring gleamed as it met the bone, her whispered vow tightening around the fragment, as though sealing it into her promise, binding it as surely as flesh binds sinew. Take you, she breathed, though the sound was more exhalation than word, and the soil echoed back, not in language but in rhythm, in hollow thuds that rose like heartbeats, slow, terrible, the beating of something long since stilled, yet moving again. Children clutched at their mothers' skirts, begging to be taken home, but no parent dared move, for their legs felt heavy as lead, their feet rooted to the ground as though the very soil held them captive to the vow. She weds him still, whispered the blind man, voice breaking. She weds him though he is dust, and he answers though he has no tongue. The minister dropped to his knees, tearing at the earth with frantic hands, trying to reach her, trying to break the communion, but the ground only deepened, softening into ash where he touched it, swallowing his fingers until he drew them back blackened and cold. And then came the sound of splitting, the sharp crack of bone breaking, though no living body lay before them, and the bride drew forth from the earth a shard of rib, long, curved, gleaming faintly under the pallid light, and she pressed it to her veil as though it were a quill to parchment, as though vows must not only be spoken but carved, inscribed into the very matter of the dead. The rib split beneath her pressure, lines etched deep into its surface, and though no one could read what she wrote, all felt it, a weight pressing on the heart, a promise that reached into their marrow. Kai's sentence carved not on the bones she held but on the bones within them. "Do you take me?" came the grinding voice again, rising from below, each word a groan of soil, of coffin wood, of things better left buried. "I do," she whispered, and the bone in her hand cracked in two, the vow sealed in silence, from the fissure spilled a black dust, fine as ash, drifting upward, and those who inhaled it found their throats dry, their tongues thick, their own voices stolen for the length of that night. as though all speech had been given over to the vow she had spoken. The veil pressed flat once more against her face, lifted by a breath that did not belong to her, and those who watched swore they saw her lips touched by lips unseen. A kiss given. Through the veil, cold and lingering, a seal upon the covenant, and as she lifted her hand from the earth, the rib bone in 2 pieces now, the ground trembled not with collapse but with preparation, the promise of something rising, something gathering, something waiting for the moment when vows turned to consummation. The cypress trees shook violently, though no wind blew, their roots groaning deep underground, and the shoes that lined the road shifted in unison, 1,000 invisible feet dragging forward, called closer to the grave where promises had been carved in bone. And when the townsfolk looked back, they saw that one of the empty shoes was no longer empty. A single skeletal toe pressing out from the leather, curled as though eager to walk again. The first sound was not music nor laughter, nor even the shuffle of guests gathering, but the slow dragging of wood against stone, as if coffins were being pulled into place instead of chairs. They said the wedding feast began at the hour when lamps burned lowest and every shadow appeared doubled, trembling as though aware of what approached. The long tables were dressed in cloth as pale as winding sheets, though no candlelight glowed upon them. Instead, the glow was of another sort, faint, phosphorescent, like the shimmer of moss that grows only in crypts where no sunlight ever dared to intrude. The benches filled, though no carriage had arrived, no footfall was heard, and no name was called. One after another, figures seated themselves with the patience of the grave, their faces hidden beneath veils of dust, their garments carrying the faint smell of turned earth. Yet when their hands reached forward, when pale fingers curled around the edges of plates, it became clear why this feast was whispered of with dread. Every hand was withered, shriveled to parchment stretched over bone. The hands of the long-buried returned to grasp what once was theirs. The bride alone sat upright at the head, her posture rigid, her eyes refusing to blink. They said her veil quivered, though no wind moved it. She looked down upon her plate and found it not empty but laden with what no living soul would eat. From coffins still open, borne upon shoulders unseen, dishes were drawn. One platter held bread, though when broken it exhaled the stench of damp cellars. Another bore meat, marbled and grey, wrapped in faded cloth like offerings exhumed. And there was fruit too, figs split open, their insides crawling not with sweetness, but with pale worms that twisted like whispers given flesh. No one spoke, no one dared. Only the faint clinking of bone against plate resounded, as skeletal fingers took up utensils not to eat, but to stir, to move, to arrange the offerings as though rehearsing the motions of the living. At last, the silence broke, not with laughter, but with a voice so thin it might have been mistaken for the hiss of a dying flame. "Bride of stone, do you partake?" She turned her head, though no one saw to whom. Her lips parted, though her breath smelled not of air, but of the iron tang of opened graves. "I will not eat," she whispered, her voice trembling like wind in hollow reeds. "I will only vow." And as she said it, the withered hands began to drum the table, not in rhythm, but in hunger, slow, uneven, a tapping of bone that echoed as if beneath the floorboards themselves the forgotten dead were answering. Plates rattled. Goblets spilled dark liquid that was not wine. The bride's veil darkened as if stained by unseen drops falling from above. She reached out with her own hand, still warm, still living, and when she touched the bread, the worms within stilled, as though acknowledging their new mistress. "She will eat for us," whispered another voice, dry and distant, as though spoken, from within a coffin lined in splinters. "She will bind us to her vow." The bride drew back, her hand trembling, but the withered hands around her closed in, every skeletal finger pointing, every shriveled palm open, as if demanding she feed them, that she honor their hunger. And when she refused, when she pressed her trembling hands to her chest and shook her veiled head, the room itself seemed to answer. The long tables groaned, the coffins from which the food had come slid closer of their own accord, and lids began to shift as though what lay inside sought to rise, to join the feast, not as guests, but as hosts. The bride rose to her feet, her voice a cry sharper than any blade. I vowed in bone, but I will not feed the dead. And in that moment the lamps guttered out, and all was lit only by the ghastly green of crypt-born moss. What they saw last, before the room was drowned in darkness, was this: the coffins tipping, the lids falling, and from within, not corpses but severed hands, pale and countless, scuttling like spiders, leaping toward the plates, toward the cups, toward the living warmth of the bride herself. The feast was not for them to eat, but for them to claim, and as the hands began to climb the veil, to knot themselves into her hair, to press against her lips as though to silence her defiance, the tables shook once more. The guests who were never named leaned forward as one, their veils slipping back, revealing not faces, but the hollow sockets of skulls, grinning wide, waiting for the moment when silence would fall forever over the hall of the feast. The last sound heard was not a scream, but the rattling applause of countless fingers clapping bone against bone, welcoming the bride into a union no priest of flesh could ever sanctify. The first sound was not a peal of celebration, nor a summons to prayer, but a single toll that seemed to shiver through the marrow of those who heard it, as though the iron tongue of the bell licked directly at their bones. It was midnight in the village when the church bell began its strange work. Its voice rolled not outward but inward, like a wave collapsing into itself. Those who stood beneath the steeple swore they saw the air ripple inwards with every strike, as though time itself were being devoured. Windows rattled, animals froze, and children wept in their sleep. Yet the most dreadful part was not the ringing. It was the way the sound moved against nature, unwinding instead of echoing, peeling itself backward like scripture unspoken, like a prayer revoked. The first toll seemed harmless, though all who heard it woke in the night with the taste of rust upon their tongues. But by the second, the harm was known. A widow who lived by the river was found in her bed with eyes wide open, her skin pale as wax, her hands curled against her chest as though in desperate prayer. By the third, a blacksmith collapsed at his forge, still gripping a hammer that had fallen cold. By the fourth, children whispered of footsteps on the church roof, heavy and deliberate. Though no man dared climb that high, the villagers gathered in fear, clutching lanterns that did little to pierce the encroaching dark. "It is not ringing for us," muttered one old woman, her voice cracked like bark. "It is ringing them back." "Back from where?" another asked. The old woman only pointed to the graveyard, where the frost seemed thicker, as if the ground exhaled a breath too deep to belong to the living. Each backward toll grew heavier, as though the bell itself was sinking into its own sound. And with each one another life was taken, claimed silently without wound or mark. The physician declared no cause, the priest dared not name one. The air smelled of iron and old smoke. By the fifth toll, the bravest swore they saw figures in the streets. Neighbors already claimed by silence, walking slowly, their steps dragging, their faces hidden as if veiled. They did not speak, nor look upon the living, but passed as though obeying a summons only they could hear. Their feet all turned in the same direction, toward the church. The priest himself at last approached the bell tower, trembling lantern in hand, his cassock fluttering as if tugged by unseen fingers. The climb was long, and each stair creaked with the weight of dread. When he reached the top, he found the bell still swaying, though no rope pulled it, its iron mouth yawning wide as if exhaling silence in place of sound. He reached for the rope, but the instant his hand touched the frayed fibers, the bell tolled again, backward, the sound sucking into the earth rather than spilling into the air. His lantern went out, yet the chamber did not fall dark. Instead, it glowed faintly with a sickly light that seemed to rise from the wood itself, and he saw, burned into the grain of the timber walls, names. The names of his flock, the names of every soul in the village. With each backward toll, one name blackened, seared as though by unseen fire, erased from the world of the living. He tried to pray, but his lips moved without voice. The sound of his own words was swallowed before it left his mouth. Desperate, he fled down the spiral stairs, yet the ringing pursued him, unraveling the seconds as he stumbled, each step pulling him deeper into a silence so vast he feared he would never escape. In the square, the villagers watched the church as though it were breathing. The windows flickered with light, then darkened again. The steeple loomed like a finger pointing not to heaven but to the grave, and then, after the seventh backward toll, the priest burst forth from the doors, his face grey, his eyes hollow, his hands trembling as though drained of blood. He opened his mouth, but what spilled forth was not a cry, not a warning, but the hollow clang of iron, as if the bell now spoke through him. The villagers fled, lanterns falling, children carried away in shaking arms. Yet some were too slow. The sound crept after them, swallowing footsteps, breaths, heartbeats. One by one bodies fell where they stood, their shadows already walking ahead of them toward the church doors. No one knew how many tolls remained. No one dared count beyond the 9th. But those who survived swore that when the bell fell silent at last, the graveyard was not as it had been. Many stones bore names that none recalled, names not of the living nor of the dead they had buried, but of strangers who had never belonged to their soil. And in the morning, when courage returned, they found the priest's body at the base of the steeple, his hand outstretched as if clawing for the rope. Yet his lips were parted wide, and from within his mouth hung a clapper of blackened iron, swinging gently, though no wind stirred it. The bed was not built, but dug, not carved by hands of love, but hollowed by the hands of decay. In the clearing beyond the churchyard, where the cypress leaned like listening giants, the bride was said to have made her chamber. No walls enclosed it, no roof crowned it. Instead, the earth itself was opened like a wound, lined with cloth already unraveling, sheets that stank of mildew, pillowcases dark with stains no rain had ever washed clean. They whispered that she had taken the discarded burial linens, torn, from coffins before the lid was sealed, and laid them across the soil as though softening it for her body. The villagers dared not look upon the place at night, for they swore they heard her there. Sighs that rose from the pit, soft as a woman at rest, yet heavy as the last breath of the dying. Each dawn, the clearing was found undisturbed, the linens smoothed, the sheets stretched as if loving hands had passed across them in the night. And yet no one had seen the bride lie down nor rise again. One boy, reckless with youth, swore he crept close one dusk when the air was swollen with the scent of cypress resin and damp earth. He claimed she was there, veiled, lying upon the soil as a bride on her wedding bed, her fingers folded across her chest. Yet as he watched, her head turned slowly toward him, though her body did not stir. Beneath the veil he saw not eyes, but hollows, dark and endless, and from those hollows poured a faint stream of ash, as though her gaze itself was burning him away. The boy returned pale and shaking, unable to speak for 3 days. When at last his tongue loosened, he whispered only, "She is not alone." For others it was not sight, but sound that haunted them. They heard 2 breaths in the pit, though only one form was seen, one shallow, one deep, one soft, one drawn like wind through an empty crypt, and between those breaths words, low vows exchanged in a tongue no ear could name, yet every soul understood in dread. "Lie still with me," she was heard to murmur, her voice tender and broken like silk tearing under water. "Forever," answered the other, though the sound was no human voice but the grinding of stone against stone, as if the earth itself spoke. Some nights the pit glowed faintly, not with fire, but with something dull and grey, like embers choked of flame yet unwilling to die. The trees around the clearing bent subtly inward, their branches reaching like skeletal arms, their roots thickening as though seeking to wrap the chamber and claim it for their own. Those who passed by in daylight found strange marks in the soil nearby. Not footprints, but impressions of knees, as if something had knelt in devotion. The marks were deep, pressed hard, as though carved by weight no flesh could bear. The old widow by the river told a story of what she saw one morning. The bride's veil draped across the pit, the folds moving though no wind blew. She swore it lifted, not outward but upward, as though drawn from beneath by unseen hands. And then she saw fingers rise from the soil, blackened, broken, the nails cracked to splinters, fingers that smoothed the sheet, tucked it neat, pulled the cloth as a dutiful husband would. The widow never returned to the clearing again. But the most dreadful tale came from the sexton, who confessed after too much wine that he once followed the sound of weeping to the place. He found the pit freshly disturbed, as though something had shifted within, the sheets wrinkled, the earth damp and unsettled, and he saw a ring glinting faintly in the soil. Iron, rusted yet binding still. He dared to reach for it, thinking to carry proof to the priest, but as his fingers closed around it, the soil quivered. He swore he felt breath, warm and fetid, exhale against his skin from beneath the ground. And a whisper, closer than thought, closer than heartbeat, slid into his ear. Not yours, he fled ringless, never to touch the soil again. Now none approach the chamber, though all know it remains. The pit never fills, though storms have drowned the fields. The linens never rot, though the seasons devour everything else. And each morning still the bed is made by hands no one sees, hands that wait, hands that promise, hands that rise higher with each passing night. And one morning soon, the villagers whisper, it will not be the bed that is made, but the guest who is taken into it. It began as a whisper among the mourners that the veil she wore was not cloth at all, but a curtain spun from sorrow itself. When she drifted through the village, her veil trailed like mist clinging to tombstones, long and grey, never lifting, even in wind. It did not shimmer like lace nor soften like linen. It hung heavy, damp with earth, as though woven from the fog of the graveyard itself. At first, the people thought it a trick of shadow when they glimpsed the faint outlines beneath, a face where no face should be, a flicker of eyes where only folds of fabric lay. But shadows are kind compared to what followed. For those who looked, too long found themselves staring into something dreadful. Behind the veil, eyes opened. Not her eyes, never hers, but the eyes of those long buried, those whose names still trembled on the tongues of the grieving. A mother swore she saw her drowned child blink at her from the cloth, the pupils clouded by water yet unblinking, unmerciful. A man fell to his knees when the veil parted just enough to reveal his brother's eyes, gouged from the mine collapse years before, still dripping soot that smeared the hem. The widow who had lost 3 sons in the war fainted in the street, for in the shifting folds of the veil she saw not 1, not 2, but 3 pairs of eyes, each wide, each accusing, each fixed upon her as if to ask why she had gone on living. It was said the veil had no pattern, no stillness. It rippled with faces, eyes blooming and vanishing like flowers of rot. And once a pair of eyes was seen, they did not fade. They followed. The blacksmith, who first confessed to seeing his father's dead stare, claimed he felt those eyes behind him as he worked, watching through the sparks, measuring each strike of his hammer. The seamstress, who saw her stillborn child's gaze in the veil, refused to enter her home again, for she said she felt the eyes pressing against her windows at night, fogging the glass with breaths that did not belong. "It is not cloth," whispered one old woman in the square, her voice trembling as she drew the sign of the cross. "It is a shroud, and every grave lends her its sorrow." Some dared to confront her, trembling as they spoke. "Bride, what eyes are these?" they asked from a distance, not daring to touch. Her voice was soft, broken yet steady, muffled by the veil. "Not mine," she whispered. "Not mine, but yours." They fled from her, but the truth remained. Once you had looked into that veil, once you had recognized the gaze of your beloved dead, you carried it with you. The faces waited for you, watching from corners, reflected in water, hidden in smoke. And when the mourners themselves passed into the grave, the villagers swore their eyes joined the veil, opening anew in the grey folds, watching the living next. The sexton told a tale of what he witnessed one night when the bride lingered in the churchyard. She knelt before a stone, her hands folded, her veil trailing long across the soil, and in the lantern glow, he saw the veil stretch upward, taut like skin, dozens of faces pressed against it from beneath, mouths moving without sound, eyes rolling in anguish. The cloth writhed like living flesh, as though those trapped within clawed for release. He swore he heard fingernails scratching, though no hand was visible. Terrified, he turned away, but not before one pair of eyes, green, familiar, fixed upon him through the veil. They were the eyes of his wife, buried not. A year passed. He dropped his lantern and fled, but he said those eyes haunted him till his deathbed, staring from shadows, gleaming in water. appearing in dreams that never ended in waking peace. And so the villagers learned not to look at her, not directly, not ever. They crossed themselves and cast their eyes to the dirt when she passed. But still, the temptation lingered. For grief, fear's cruel, and those who longed most to see their beloved once more found themselves drawn, helpless, toward her shrouded form. Some went willingly. Some sought her veil in secret, and each returned with the same pallor, the same trembling hands, the same whisper on their lips. I saw them, they see me still, and each one, without exception, went to their grave within the year. They said the ground itself grew jealous of her lips, for no living man had ever touched them. On certain nights when the fog curled low and the cypress dripped like weeping statues, the bride was seen kneeling in the graveyard, her veil sweeping the earth. She did not kneel in prayer, she bowed in longing. Her body bent forward, deliberate and slow, as though pulled by a weight beneath the soil, her hands trembling against the stone. And when her head lowered, when her face pressed against the grass, a stillness fell over the world. Birds hushed. Winds faltered. Even the insects seemed to die in silence. Witnesses swore she kissed the ground, yet it was no simple kiss. Her lips parted, her breath caught, and she lingered there as though joined to another mouth that none could see. Some said the earth shifted beneath her, rising subtly to meet her, lifting as if to return her passion. Others whispered they saw a shadow rise between the blades of grass, no taller than a man's face, meeting her kiss with a hunger that blackened the soil where they touched. The marks remained long after. Patches of grass shriveled into char, as though kissed not by lips but by frost and flame at once. The black earth spread in rings, widening each time she returned, until whole sections of the churchyard grew barren, patches of ash where once lilies had grown. "He is here," she whispered once, when a widow dared ask what she kissed. Her voice cracked like a candle guttering in wind. "He waits, and he answers." But when the widow pressed further, asking, "Who?" the bride's head turned, veil trembling, and though her lips did not move, a second voice issued from the ground itself, deep, hollow, echoing as if spoken through stone, the one she promised. From then on, the villagers did not linger near the graveyard at night. Still, some could not resist, drawn by grief or curiosity, and their tales bled into the lore like poison. One claimed he saw the bride lift her veil before kissing, her mouth pale as bone, her teeth chattering as if the cold rose through her. Another swore he saw frost form upon her lips, white rime glowing in the moonlight, as though she kissed. Winter's breath itself. And a third, trembling, said he saw something worse. A tongue grey and swollen slide from the soil to meet hers, slick with mud and grave water. The villagers called it blasphemy. The priest called it witchcraft, but none dared stop her, for each who watched too long felt the chill creep into their own mouths, as though something pressed ghost-cold lips against theirs in the night, stealing their warmth. The children were warned never to follow her. Yet one girl, no more than 10, confessed she had seen the bride walking toward the graveyard at dusk and trailed her, barefoot and curious. The child swore she heard 2 sets of footsteps, one soft, one dragging, as though pulled from deep water. When she reached the churchyard wall, she saw the bride kneeling, veil spilling across the ground. And she saw the grass writhe, not only blacken but wriggle, as if each blade were a finger clawing upward, desperate to touch her lips. The child screamed, and the bride's head lifted slowly, too slowly, her veil still clinging to the soil. When it tore free, the child swore she saw a second mouth imprinted in the fabric, gaping wide, drooling ash. She never spoke again. By the harvest season, the ground of the churchyard was ruined. Black patches spread like rot across the graves, and from the soil rose a bitter stench, sweet as honey, sick as corpses. The villagers began to whisper of plague. Livestock avoided the place, lowing in fear when driven near. Even the crows would not land. But still, she kissed. Soon, she was overheard whispering as she bent to the soil, her lips trembling, her hands clutching the ground with desperation. "Soon you will rise." And on one winter's night, when frost lay heavy across the land, the villagers heard something far worse than the tolling bell. They heard a smacking sound, wet and deliberate, like two mouths clinging together. The air grew colder, the fog thickened, and though no one dared step forward, all who listened swore they heard a laugh. Low, hollow, carried not from her lips but from the earth beneath. They said her house never knew darkness, and that was why no one dared enter it. Lanterns lined the eaves, the windows, the porch, even the low trees around her garden. Some were old tin, others rusted iron, some no more than jars with broken handles. They burned through storm and through snow, never dimming, never flickering, never dying. Villagers watched with dread when thunder split the sky and rain poured in sheets, for though the world drowned, those lanterns still glowed, their pale fire crawling like worms in glass. At first, the light was mistaken for ordinary flame. Yellow, wavering, too steady. But when one ventured close, the difference became unbearable. No heat touched the skin, no smoke drifted upward. The glow crawled, thick and sluggish, like a nest of luminous beetles pressed against glass. If one stared long enough, one saw them move, coiling, knotting, writhing against each other. They gave the illusion of light, but the air stayed cold. And when the wind howled through the village, the sound around her home was stranger still. Not the hiss of fire, but a low hum, a droning whisper, as though each lantern held a throat. That spoke in unison, muttering words too soft to be caught. Children dared each other to creep near. Some returned, trembling, insisting they heard the lanterns whisper their names. Others swore they saw eyes within the glow, pale eyes pressed against the glass, rolling and blinking as though trapped. One boy claimed he knocked over a jar lantern and saw the light spill free, not like fire but like a pale worm, fat and wet, wriggling into the grass before dissolving into smoke. He was beaten for lying, yet his mother whispered that afterward his own eyes glowed faintly in the dark, like two lanterns that would not shut. The woman inside never spoke of them. She moved as though unaware, going about her days in silence, veiled and pale, her figure shifting through the windows like a shadow sewn into curtains. But neighbors swore they saw her feeding the lanterns. When dusk fell and the glow grew restless, she walked among them, carrying bowls of something dark, thicker than broth, heavier than water. She tilted each bowl into the mouths of the lanterns, and though glass should not swallow, each vessel emptied, its crawling light growing brighter, pulsing like a heart after drink. "She keeps them alive," the blacksmith's wife muttered, refusing to lift her gaze when passing the house. "But what are they, if not flame?" One night, when the storm raged so fierce that trees cracked in half, a lantern burst. The glass shattered. With a cry like a child's gasp, the villagers gathered at their windows to watch. They expected fire to spill and vanish in the rain, but what poured forth was not fire, it was shape. Something long, white, translucent, dragged itself across the porch. Its body was segmented like bone knotted with muscle, its length glistening with a wet sheen. It crawled toward the steps before curling back, coiling in on itself, and then slithered upright into the shattered frame. Within moments, the lantern filled again with crawling glow, as though it had never broken at all. After that, the villagers stopped pretending they had seen nothing. They spoke of curses, of bargains, of debts owed to the dead. Some whispered that the lanterns were souls, harvested, bottled, starved until they obeyed. Others said the creatures were unborn things, never given bodies, forever trapped in glass as punishment. And one old man who had seen wars and pestilence crossed himself when passing her home and muttered, "No, not unborn, unfinished." The light grew hungrier as winter deepened. Doors rattled in the night, shutters shook, and those nearest her home swore they saw pale glow leaking across the ground like mist, curling around their thresholds, pressing against their windows. The lanterns did not stay still anymore. Some swayed, though no wind moved them. Some clattered against each other, as if laughing. And one night a girl disappeared. She was last seen playing by the hedges near that cursed garden. Her ribbon was found later, snagged on a lantern's iron handle, damp with something that was not rain. For weeks the family wept, searching the woods, the wells, the river. But when the villagers passed her home at dusk, they swore one lantern glowed brighter than the rest, its light pinker, softer like flesh behind thin skin. If one stared too long, They swore they saw the girl's small face within, eyes wide, mouth open, lips moving in silence. Her mother would not look. By then, no villager walked the road that passed the house. They circled wide, even if it meant hours more to their journey. At night, the glow was seen on the hillsides, weaving through the dark like a procession of watchful eyes. The hum grew louder, a droning chorus that seemed to press against the skull, rattling the teeth, whispering in a tongue none knew yet all feared to understand. But still she fed them. Still she bowed her head and poured the dark broth into the glass mouths. And when the broth ran out, some swore they saw her lift her own hand to the edge of the lantern and cut her palm, letting her blood drip inside. The light shivered, flared, and hummed in hunger. On the last night of that winter, the lanterns did something they had never done before. They went out. For one breath, the house was dark, the garden black. The villagers sighed in relief, crossing themselves, daring to hope the curse had ended. But then, one by one, the lanterns lit again, brighter than before, their glow searing, crawling in wild frenzy against the glass. And in the brief moment, they had gone out. Every villager swore they had seen it, shapes filling the darkness, crawling across the walls of the house, pressed against every window, thousands of them waiting for light to cage them once more. They said the marsh was a place where sound itself went to rot, and that no cry, no prayer, no hymn ever rose clean from its waters. But on the eve of her wedding, the villagers heard voices rising from the mire, voices that did not belong to any living throat. It began with a hum, low, guttural, as if a cavern breathed beneath the surface. Those nearest the marsh, the fishermen and the gatherers of reeds, pressed their palms to their ears, for the sound seemed to come not from air, but from inside their skulls, like wet lungs expanding where no air should be. Then came the first, word dragged from the silt like a drowned man's final gasp. Her name, over and over, through muck and water, through bubbling foam, her name was sung, though no singer stood upon the bank. The old said they knew the sound. They said it was the voices of men long buried without right, soldiers who had sunk into bog and mud during wars the young had forgotten. They had lain voiceless for decades, denied both bell and psalm. Now, on the night of her binding, they rose. The villagers gathered at the edge, lanterns trembling in their hands. The reeds shivered though no wind passed, and the water rippled though no fish broke the surface. Pale bubbles rose, one after another, bursting into whispers. When the lantern light caught them, shapes could be seen just beneath, faces pressed against the water's skin, mouths opening, closing, gnashing without air, yet sound spilling forth. She must not answer, hissed the midwife, clutching her rosary until her fingers bled. If she speaks, they will take her with them, but some swore she already had. In her bridal veil, pale as mist, she walked barefoot into the marsh grass. Her steps sank into mud, her hem drank the water, yet still, she drifted forward, as though drawn by the unseen hands beneath. The choir grew louder. Bass voices rumbled like shifting earth, tenor cries cracked like reeds in wind, falsetto shrieks cut like the cries of gulls. Each tone clashed, yet together they wove a song that no ear could bear long without trembling. Those who dared linger said the marsh changed as she approached. The water swelled as if something vast pressed upward from beneath. Froth gathered at the surface, streaked with red, as though blood seeped from unseen wounds. And still the voices sang, not in harmony but in desperation, a congregation of the lost. "Bride," they gurgled, "bride of breath, bride of bone, bride of the earth above us." She raised her veil, and though her lips did not move, the choir roared, louder, thrashing in joy, as if her silence itself was consent. The water frothed higher, red surging into the lantern light, and one by one the villagers turned away, for those faces in the mire now stared not at her, but at them. Men without eyes, with sockets filled with black water, mouths lined with silt, yet every throat moving, every sound a plea and a curse at once. Then came the moment that none could forget. The surface broke, hands, withered and pale, burst upward from the mire. They were not bones, not flesh, but something between, sodden sinew clinging to joints, fingers swollen and splitting, nails black with centuries of rot. Dozens of them, then hundreds, reached through the water, clawing toward the veil, toward the lanterns, toward any living thing within reach. One villager cried out and fled, swearing later that one hand gripped his ankle, cold as stone, heavy as a gravestone, leaving a bruise shaped like a ring of fingers that never faded. Another swore a voice followed him home, humming behind his ear in the dark until dawn. But she did not run. She knelt at the bank, her face inches above the frothing mire, her veil dipping into the red foam. The voices screamed then, an agony that made the reeds tremble and the birds explode from the trees. The water boiled crimson, and in that chaos, the villagers swore they saw the drowned lift their heads above the surface at last. Men long forgotten, their faces twisted with the terror of dying, their mouths wide, not only in song but in hunger. Bright, they moaned again, kiss the water, bind the vow. And though no one dared come closer, every witness swore they saw it happen. Her lips touched the surface. The foam parted. A shape rose to meet her, a face half eaten by rot, half swallowed by mud, yet grinning with the triumph of the grave. Their mouths joined in silence, yet the sound that followed was not silence at all but a scream that rang backward, as though time itself recoiled. The lanterns on the shore went out, the villagers scattered into the night, their ears bleeding, their eyes burning with the memory of faces they would never forget. But one truth none could deny. When the lanterns were lit again at dawn, her veil was found floating on the bank, soaked in red, smoothed as though by unseen hands. And from the marsh, the choir had not ceased. For nights afterward, their voices lingered. Every dusk they sang her name, every dawn the water trembled as if laughing, and though no villager dared approach again, they said the song grew louder, closer, as though the drowned had found the path out of water, as though the choir was no longer content to sing from beneath. They swore no child had ever lived in that house, yet every passerby heard a lullaby drifting through the shutters at dusk, soft as moth wings, heavy as earth. The sound began faint, no more than the hum of wind against wood, but lingered long. Enough that travellers paused, shivered, and whispered their prayers. The melody was always the same, low, aching, unbroken, as though sung by a throat that had never breathed fresh air. And then came the rattle, like pebbles shifting, like gravel spilling from a tilted jar. Inside, villagers claimed, she sat by the hearth with her arms cradled close, swaying back and forth. But no one had ever seen her child. Some said it was born still, and she refused to bury it. Others swore no child had ever been born at all, only the shape of one pressed from stone and clay, placed in her lap, as though the earth itself pitied her. The cradle sat in the center of the room, carved, of limestone so old it seemed to sweat with dew even in the dry months. Its rock surface was cracked but always damp, as though something within kept it alive. Those who stepped near said the stone pulsed faintly, like the throb of a vein too deep to cut, and within it lay not a babe of flesh, but a mound of dust, fragments of gravel and a scatter of small brittle bones, too small to belong to any creature but one. Still she sang, still she rocked. "Sleep, my darling," she whispered, her voice threaded with tenderness and rot. "The night is only a veil." And the dust shifted. The bones clicked faintly, as if stirred by a restless dream. Then, soft but undeniable, the scrape of fingers, small and desperate, scratching the cradle's inner stone walls. Children dared each other to press an ear to the shutters. Most came away pale, swearing they had heard the faint rasp of infant nails against rock. One boy did not speak for months after. His hair turned white as frost before he reached 15. When rainstorms came, the cradle wept. Villagers passing by swore they saw dark water dripping through the floorboards beneath her parlor window. The earth around the house never grew weeds. Not a single blade of grass survived, though the fields around bloomed with wild rye. Something in that soil had been fed differently, with a hunger unseen. Whispers spread that she had bargained, that she had longed so fiercely for a child, she went down into the quarry at midnight, where stonecutters swore they heard her voice echo long after the hammers had ceased. There, in the dust of the earth's wounds, she had rocked empty air until the stones themselves gave her what flesh could not. A child of their making, heavy with silence, teeth budding from shards of shale. One widow swore she had entered the house and seen the cradle up close. She claimed the dust breathed, that she saw its rise and fall like the belly of something sleeping. The widow swore she heard not one heartbeat, but many, layered over one another like a swarm caught in a jar. She never returned, and a week later she was found lying stiff in her bed, her arms clasped as if cradling something too heavy for the living. The scratching beneath the floorboards grew louder in the autumn months. At night, neighbors pressed pillows to their ears to drown it out. It was not only from the cradle now, but from beneath the very earth. Tiny hands raking upward, dozens of them, hundreds perhaps, each clawing toward a light they had never seen. On winter nights, the rocking of the cradle shook the entire house. Some swore they saw the window panes quiver, others that they heard the stones grinding as though sharpening themselves on her song. "Rest, my darling," she whispered into the dust. "Rest, for the ground is kind." But the ground was not kind. When spring thaw came, the earth behind her house broke open. A mound of stones erupted like teeth from the soil, arranged not by weather nor by men, but by something that remembered the shape of a crib. Each stone bore a mark, long scratches, as if tiny fingernails had etched them from within. The villagers fled. No one tended the house, but still the song rose, carried on the wind each dusk, heavy as bells tolling for the forgotten. The cradle remained, crumbling yet whole, forever damp, forever rocking, though no hand touched it, and those who lingered too long near its window swore they felt a weight pressing into their arms, cold and rough, like the heft of gravel, but unmistakably shaped like a sleeping child. The last to speak of it was a young mother who confessed in trembling gasps that she had walked past the house at dusk. She heard the lullaby, saw the rocking shadow, and then, clear as day, felt small fingers wrap around her own. She never finished her story. Her body was found the next morning on the threshold of the house, her chest torn open, her ribs packed, with pebbles as though something had reached in and tried to build itself anew. And still, from the cradle of stones, the lullaby drifted soft as dust, heavy as earth. They buried her more than once, but the earth never kept her. The first interment was simple, hurried, done with trembling hands and no hymns, for the villagers feared her breathless stillness. Yet when dawn came, she was seen again, wandering, between the cypress roots, veil trailing with soil, eyes open, skin pale but untouched by decay. The grave they had dug for her was filled with nothing but crushed flowers, their petals blackened, their stems limp as drowned hair. "She won't stay," whispered the old women, clutching their shawls tighter. "She belongs neither to us nor to them." The second burial was deeper, under stones and salt, with prayers pressed hard into the night air. Still, before the week was out, she was found again at the edge of the marsh, her dress heavy with damp, her hands resting on her lap, as though she had merely sat down to wait. The stones were cracked in the pit, the salt dissolved, the soil wet and clinging as though something within had pushed its way upward. Her face never aged. Her lips held color, though no pulse warmed them. But it was the smell that betrayed her, soil, thick and pungent, like the floor of a graveyard after rain. That smell clung to her like perfume, sour, damp and unyielding, making animals flee and children cry out in their sleep. Those who passed her on the road dared not meet her eyes, their heads lowered, their hands clenched around rosaries. They muttered psalms between their teeth. Yet still the corners of their vision betrayed them. She never blinked, never faltered in her steps, as if her path was drawn by a hand unseen. Where she walked, no life endured. Grass yellowed overnight, roots curled into themselves, and even the proud magnolia blooms turned brown as she neared. One man swore he laid fresh roses upon her path, hoping to soften her tread. Before her foot touched them, the petals withered, curling into ash, leaving only brittle stems as though scorched by invisible fire. The children whispered a tale. They said she fed on blossoms, that each flower she passed gave its life so her flesh would remain unbroken. They told of a boy who dared to follow too close, clutching a daisy chain in his hands. When she turned her face toward him, the chain blackened in an instant, and his hair, though he was but 10, turned white as snow. "She's waiting," muttered the blacksmith, whose hammer once rang for her wedding trousseau. "Waiting for a grave deep enough, dark enough to bind her. Until then, she will walk." The villagers grew restless. Doors were bolted earlier each night, lanterns burned low toward her shadow, and paths near the churchyard were abandoned. Yet still her steps pressed into the soil, unhurried, unerring, weaving through the houses, through the fields, as though tracing some forgotten pattern beneath the town itself. Those who smelled her passing in the night described it as a suffocation. "Like the coffin's lid closed above me," whispered one woman, her eyes hollow, and the air itself grew damp, too heavy to breathe. On the 13th night, she paused. The villagers, peering through cracks in their shutters, swore she turned her face toward them at last, pale, untouched by time, her skin smooth as the day she first donned her veil. She stood in silence at the center of the square. Not a wrinkle, not a blemish, not a crack marred her face. Yet her dress hung in tatters, damp with earth, the train trailing clods of mud and roots. Her hands, folded over her waist, clutched something small, something that glistened in the moonlight. It was a flower, not withered, not blackened, but whole. A single white lily, untouched, its petals luminous in the night air. She lifted it to her face, inhaled, and for the first time, the villagers heard her voice. Not yet. The sound was not hers. It was the soil's, the voice of the earth itself, low, grainy, endless, echoing like stones grinding beneath the ground. The lily withered as she spoke, crumbling into grey dust that spilled between her fingers. The villagers wept in silence, for they understood then she would not rot because she was not bound to death. She walked between states, feeding on what should flourish, sustained by what should fade. Her body was the grave, her skin the coffin lid, her breath the cold, damp air of the tomb, and as dawn broke, she did not vanish. She lingered in the square, her veil shifting in the pale light, her eyes fixed not on the ground but on the villagers' homes. One by one, shutters closed, hearts trembled, but children later claimed that as the sun rose, her shadow did not move with the light. It stayed where it was, stretched long, bent. Wrong pointing not to the ground but to the churchyard. The last who dared look swore they saw her lips twitch, not in a smile, but in hunger. The churchyard was never still, not even in the hours when owls gave up their hunting and the crickets ceased their song. Something always moved in the earth, some small shift, some stirring, as if the graves themselves breathed when no one watched. The 13th night, when the bell rang backward and the bride was last seen standing in the square, the villagers counted the headstones as they had always done, desperate for certainty, for order, for the comfort of numbers. 12 graves, always 12, but that morning there were 13. The new stone stood crooked at the edge of the cemetery, pale as bone, flecked with moss, as though it had been standing for decades rather than hours. No name was etched into it, no date of birth or death, only a shallow surface that seemed to ripple when touched by dawn light. The villagers swore it cast no shadow of its own, yet upon it lay the shadow of a woman in a veil, her shadow. The priest approached first, his hands trembling though he clutched the cross so hard the metal cut his palm. "It cannot be," he muttered, eyes darting between the nameless stone and the graves he had blessed years before. There were only ever 12, but no one argued. They could all see it, the 13th tomb, wrong and uninvited, standing proud among the rest. Atsimman. Dusk. The men of the town gathered their tools, axes, hammers, chisels, anything to break the stone before it rooted itself deeper into the soil. They struck it until their arms bled from effort, until their voices cracked with curses. The stone cracked, split, shattered, fell in pieces across the grass. Beneath it was no coffin, no body, only an empty hollow lined with worms. But when morning came, the stone was whole again, and not as it was before, its edges sharper, its surface smoother, as though each act of destruction refined it, gave it strength. The villagers recoiled. None dared touch it that day. By the 3rd night, whispers spread that the stone breathed. Those who lingered at the churchyard swore they heard a low inhaling from the soil, steady, patient, deep as the sea. Some claimed to feel it in their own lungs, as though each breath they drew was not their own, but borrowed. On the 7th night, the midwife approached the stone. She was old, Too old to fear death, her eyes hollow with the weight of secrets, she pressed her ear against the nameless tomb and whispered, "Who waits for you?" The answer did not come in words, but in movement. The soil shuddered, and the tombstone exhaled. A rush of air, damp and cold, carrying the stench of turned earth, washed over the cemetery, extinguishing every lantern. The midwife stumbled back, clutching her chest, gasping as though something invisible pressed upon her ribs. By morning, she was found dead in her bed, her skin grey, her lips filled with soil. Still, the 13th tomb remained. The children, curious and cruel, played at daring one another to step across its shadow. But those who did never played again. One boy returned with a withered hand, shriveled like an old man's. Another returned with no voice, his throat working soundlessly, his cries reduced to silence. A girl vanished entirely, her shoes left, neatly at the base of the stone, as if she had simply stepped into it. "It grows stronger," whispered the priest, his eyes wide with sleeplessness. "Each soul it takes, each strike we give, it grows stronger. It waits for her." And he was right. On the 13th dawn, the bride returned. Her veil hung heavy with damp, her skin untouched by time, her hands folded neatly across her waist. She walked through the cemetery without a glance at the other graves, without a pause, for the stones marked by names and dates. Her steps led her only to the 13th tomb. The villagers watched from behind trees and shutters, breath shallow, prayers rattling in their throats. They saw her place her hand upon the stone, pale, fingers against pale surface. They saw her shadow align with the shadow etched upon its face, and they saw the stone tremble, not with resistance, but with welcome. "Home," she whispered, though her lips did not move. The words seemed to echo from within the earth itself, a resonance of soil and worm and silence. The stone split open, not with violence but with invitation. A seam appeared, blacker than night, wide enough for one body to slip inside. The bride turned her face toward the village once, veil stirring with unseen wind, eyes gleaming with something beyond mercy. Then she stepped into the tomb. The seam closed, the stone sealed. The 13th tomb was whole again, and yet those who dared approach swore they still saw her shadow on its surface, faint, blurred, as though she waited just beneath, watching. And worse, when they pressed their ears to it, they swore they heard not one breath but two, woven together, as though bride and groom finally lay side by side beneath the earth.